Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. As Chloe said, I'm an architect. My name is Homeado. Also a landscape architect, and I'm saying this because the work that I'm going to present here today is a research that the kind of research that I have been doing for the last 15, 20 years, something like that. That comes from the perspective of design. So the idea is what we learn with probably people like you, and how can we use this knowledge to apply to design, and especially to design for wildlife in cities, because I'm an architect. So cities are important, and because I'm a landscape architect, wildlife is important, and just because I like wildlife. So there's reason enough. So this study I developed with my partner, and I say this because it started very conveniently when we moved from an apartment in the city of Vitória, in the state of Espírito Santo in Brazil. So we moved from an apartment to a house with a garden by the beach. And then suddenly we start to realize that, well, there are so many birds in the world. So these are just a few examples of the 27 species that we saw and photographed and identified in our garden. And we thought, well, such a great diversity of birds. What's happening in this? It was a neighborhood, it's a city. It was by the beach, but it was an urban area. So, wow, this place is really good. So what's happening? So we started looking at the landscape, air photos, maps, and then realized that actually we're seeing less than 10% of the species that were supposed or that could be inhabiting that space. We identified actually 278 species in the literature that could be there. So then the approach changed. So instead of telling people, well, this is so good, you should do cities like this, we started looking for interventions. We start to investigate interventions that a landscape architect or an architect could use to promote the conservation and viability of a greater number of bird species in cities. And we do this through a research through design approach. So we use the knowledge that is produced by scientists, and we use them for designing and testing if this knowledge actually works in this context. I'm not going to expose you to the complexity of this diagram, but the important thing is that the first columns there talks about creating a framework, a theoretical framework to apply to design. And from the literature, we extract knowledge that we convert into design guidelines, and then we test into different design alternatives. So right now we are at this stage with one. We don't have a design, but we're starting with this. So then we analyze if it works, and then we can revise the guidelines that you have produced and apply again. And this can be repeated in multiple iterations until we get something that is meaningful and that could be applied by other people when they design cities. Designers, planners, municipalities. So could be the basis for creating policy, for example, if they are interested in having more birds in cities. So for this research, a more simple version of that diagram. So we looked at the ornithology and more specific urban ornithology literature. We came up with guidelines at 3 different scales. Probably you all look at different scales, but for landscape architects, it's very important that we look at multiple scales on how the problem is framed and how we can solve problems or address problems at different scales. So in this case, a local scale, from the residential garden to small squares, to the urban scale, all the mosaic of open spaces that can be designed or changed to address the problem, and a broader landscape scale. So we design and test, we assess the results of this application of guidelines, In this case, well, every time we have a landscape analysis, it's a very important phase for knowing the landscape that we're dealing with, which also relates to selecting species that are going to be addressed or targeted. In this case, in the study case that I'm going to show you, we focused mostly in some specific habitats, especially birds related to aquatic environments and also forest environments, which were the most affected in that area. And then we revised guidelines, as I told before. But also, when we learn about the landscape and we look specifically at a certain landscape, there are some contextual aspects that come up from there. So, I'm not going to talk about all the guidelines, and I'm just highlighting here some urban scale guidelines that were important for that region there, for that small. And to give a context, we chose a 450 hectare area, very different from the case that I have seen today. It's a very small scale considered to the other studies that we saw today. So there are some specialists, in this case, the aquatic birds and the forest birds that were mostly affected. So there are some guidelines and interventions that have to be tested there, implementing interior habitats for the forest species, and recovering riparian vegetation, which is very damaged there, as we see in this image here. So these are two images of this 450 hectares with 50 years apart. So this area is also part of the Atlantic forest biome. So it was fully covered with dense umbrophilous forest. And then this is 500 years of development, occupation, almost 500 years. So what was previously forest became pasture mainly, as the image we see in 1970. And with a little bit of urban development starting by the beach, so vacation houses. So 2019, it was mostly urbanized. But also we see at the center of the image here, now some forest recovering, so some area that was protected, but some unfortunate politician decide to have a road crossing here. So we have some potential areas that could be addressed to improve the bird community there. So this is just a representation for us to understand how fragmented is this landscape. So of course, red is urban. The salmon is another type of urban, but not so densely occupied. So most of the area is urban. And you see these patchy green blobs appearing there. So those are areas that, darker is better. They are in a more advanced stage of succession. But most of them, they have some problems and they could be improved, especially the light green ones. Some areas to call attention, the mangroves along the river, they are very damaged. The 𝐍𝐿𝐴 vegetation, which is this brushy vegetation along the coast, and also very damaged because people use the beach. The main recreation activity is going to the beach, so there are kiosks on the beach, there are lots of activities. So there are these specific things about the location that affect, and that they are not in the literature, we could not use. So this patchy landscape with a large diversity of land use and land cover, the use of the beach, the potential to host many species, but it is not. And 𝐷𝐿𝐴𝐷s that demand attention, the nectarivores and frugivores, so we should pay attention to this. And habitats that demand attention, especially the aquatic ones, mangrove, 𝐍𝐿𝐴, and wetlands that are west of the site, and the forests. So this is a mapping of potential things that places that we should address, use these guidelines to design. It's not design yet, but just a mapping of where things could be done at the urban scale, not the local scale. We can trace some relationships with a larger scale, landscape scale, but it's still at the urban scale. And I'm not going to read all of them. Important thing, the 3 new sets of information that we need to address this, to consolidate the paths along the Restinga vegetation, remove the kiosks, or do some management to contain the human use there. And also there is, a small patch of eucalyptus here that is not in the right place anymore. So that could evolve to something else also. So some new guidelines come from studying this case, this concept. I've talked about that already. So at the end, we had 8 local scale guidelines, which we didn't talk about here, but they are going to be used for further investigation, especially because design is actually going to happen at this scale. Street trees, small squares, urban parks, gardens, etc. 8 urban scale guidelines, 4 landscape scale guidelines, and 4 contextual guidelines. Next steps, zoom in to develop the local scale and actually design the thing. Assess the effects on birds, and probably this is going to be done using an individual-based model. We don't know exactly which species we are going to address, but probably a set of streets or species, and even maybe a hypothetical species that gets life history information from several species, so we can address a larger group of species. Review and improve the guidelines, hoping that this is going to be useful information for designers, planners, city officials, etc., people that want to improve urban avian biodiversity. Thank you.